Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I am your host, Eric Bjornstad. You can consider me your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. The Fuel Pulse Show podcast is where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. And so what are we going to talk about today? Well, today's episode is a little follow-up to a previous episode where we talked about the idea that hot summers make it more likely that they will be followed by a colder than usual winter. The summer of 2023 is going to be remembered by all of us as the hottest one on record. Lots of places across the country set all kinds of records, not just for hottest one-day temperatures, but also records for periods of sustained heat. Remember, you may have heard Phoenix, Arizona doubled their record with 31 straight days hitting 110 degrees. Death Valley, Nevada came really close to setting the record for the hottest spot ever on the face of the earth. They hit 128 degrees, and those were ground air temperatures that are not feels-like estimations. So for some different reasons that we highlighted in that previous episode, this hot summer that we're having means there's a greater than normal chance that we could end up having a colder than usual winter. So a coming cold winter, if it hits us, it's going to bring with it diesel fuel gelling problems for those people who have stored diesel fuel that needs to be taken care of. And so they're going to need to prepare for those winter problems, especially if they have fuel that has to serve some kind of what we would call mission critical function this winter. For example, a hospital that has backup fuel for its emergency systems, or a telecommunications tower with a generator that has backup fuel, because as we know, the winter never stops the internet, right? So speaking of fuel gelling, right? Fuel gels in cold weather because the colder the temperatures get, the less soluble that fuel's paraffin content becomes. See, all diesel fuel oils have classes of molecules called paraffins, and those are in the fuel as part of their molecular makeup. And these paraffins can be of all different sizes, usually governed by the number of carbons in those molecules. Now, at normal ambient temperatures, those paraffins are dissolved in the fuel, and they just stay in there as part of that fuel's normal makeup. But as the temperatures cool down, as the fuel cools down, it can reach a point where those paraffin molecules may start to become insoluble. And when that happens, they will start to drop out or come out of the fuel, and they will come out as little crystals, if you will. And when this happens enough that those crystals can be seen, that is what we call the cloud point temperature of the fuel. Then as the temperature continues to drop, this process of these paraffin molecules, these paraffin crystals appearing in the fuel, this process will accelerate. The paraffin crystals will then start to stick, they'll run into each other and they'll start to stick together, and they will grow larger and larger and larger, and eventually they will cause the fuel to thicken. Now, if this fuel happens to be traveling through a fuel system, the paraffins will start collecting in the fuel filter. And eventually, if enough of them do that, eventually they will plug the filter enough that adequate fuel flow is interrupted and the engine shuts down. Now, the temperature at which enough of the paraffins in the fuel have dropped out and collected in that filter and plugged the fuel filter enough to cut off fuel flow, that temperature is known as the cold filter plug point. This is the second temperature you often hear referenced beyond cloud point, at least in terms of temperatures that inform when a fuel user might expect to have to deal with cold weather problems. So, in terms of temperature, we have cloud point and we have cold filter plug point temperature. Now, we think that cloud point's a little better temperature to rely on if you're talking about planning for winter diesel problems. We think cloud point's a little better than cold filter plug point for the simple fact that cold filter plug point is, shall we say, equipment dependent. Remember, the cold filter plug point temperature is actually is determined as a fuel specification. It uses a specific test, a specific ASTM test, and that test will use a special apparatus, a specially designed apparatus that will try to simulate filter plugging. But in the end, that test, that apparatus, is just merely trying to predict when something might happen in that particular fuel. When that particular thing, that thing being filter plugging from all the paraffins, when that actually happens really depends on the engine that it's being used in. I mean, today's common rail diesel engines, they notoriously have higher cold filter plug point temperatures. In other words, they plug and they shut down at higher temperatures than in the past because their fuel filters have smaller tolerances. They are what we would call higher performing filters. They have smaller tolerances, which means they catch more of the paraffins, and so they plug up sooner. They plug up at higher temperatures. So the cold filter plug point actually really depends on the equipment itself. And as we know, everybody's equipment might be a little bit different. The cloud point temperature, on the other hand, is just a property of the fuel itself. It does not depend on what kind of equipment the fuel is being used in. And so we think that that makes cloud point a little bit more of a reliable indicator for the purposes of trying to plan for preventing cold weather diesel problems. So, preventing a gelling problem, that can only be done by adding something to the fuel that causes the temperatures at temperatures at which the paraffins cause a problem. It causes that temperature to change. It changes that temperature, makes it lower, in fact. Now, some people might try to say that in order to fix a gelling problem, quote unquote, they might try to say fixing a gelling problem when they are describing this situation. But we're not really talking about fixing the problem. What we're really talking about is preventing the problem, not solving the aftermath of a gelling problem, if you will, after it's happened and the engine is shut down. What we're really interested in is prevention here. So, adding something to the fuel, what kind of thing could you add to the fuel to prevent a gelling problem? Well, this class of compounds that's used to do this, they are commonly called antigels. They're commonly referred to by the name antigels. And antigels are blended packages of different chemical constituents, and they contain different classes of ingredients that help with the gelling problem. They do different things because they address different aspects of that problem, if you will, including they'll do things like they will, if any of the paraffin crystals come out of the fuel, they will actually keep those crystals instead of allowing them to sink to the bottom and start collecting on surfaces. One of the chemicals in an antigel package will actually cause those crystals to stay suspended in the fuel, and they will also cause them to repel each other a little bit, keep away from each other, which means they're less likely to stick to each other, which means it slows the rate at which they grow faster, which means it slows the rate at which the fuel may try to gel. Now, the longer that you can keep those kinds of things from happening, the longer that can be done, the greater the temperature margin that the fuel has before it starts to be the cause of a gelling problem. So effectively, what antigels do is they lower the ambient temperature at which a user can expect the paraffins in the diesel fuel to cause operational problems for them. So, who tends to use antigel treatments? Well, the short answer to that is anyone who has a good reason to keep their diesel fuel from gelling. They will use an antigel in the winter to prevent those anticipated problems. Another one might be those people who manage fuel in cold climates. They typically will consider antigels to be one of the stock treatments they have to expect to use each winter. So, a lot of people expect to have to procure antigel for the coming winter months, so they expect to have to factor that purchase into their fuel budget. Now, antigel isn't something that businesses really at least businesses in colder climates. It's not something that businesses will wait until the dead of winter to get. Many buying decisions for antigels may be made in July, August, September. So this is about the time of the year when businesses are making their cold flow decisions, which means it's a good time to talk about when you really need to use that antigel. In other words, we want to look at the questions like, are there any signs, any markers that will tell you if you're a fuels manager and you're thinking about uh, when you need to use this kind of thing? Are there any signs or markers that will tell you when you need to treat the fuel that you have? So, to answer that question, we have to acknowledge again that fuel gelling and any resulting operational problems from fuel gelling, those are temperature dependent first and foremost. When they happen depends on what temperature the paraffin content of your fuel starts becoming insoluble and starts showing up in the fuel. So, if you're going to use an antigel to help with this potential problem, you have to realize that an antigel isn't actually going to help you unless it's already present in the fuel when those paraffins appear. That means it's important to know something really important about the fuel that you have. And that is, at what point will those paraffins start to appear? In other words, what you really need to know, in fact, this may be the most important thing you need to know about your fuel. That is, what is the cloud point temperature of your fuel? Answering the question, when should I plan to treat? That requires you to know a couple of key temperatures. Temperature number one is, how cold is it going to be outside? In other words, what's the ambient temperature? And then number two, what's the cloud point temperature for the fuel that I have? Knowing those two data points can really help you figure this all out. But if you don't know either one of them, or if you don't know one of them, in other words, if you don't know both of them, that makes answering that question really challenging, because you don't know one of the two most important things you need to know. And so that means that it's going to cause you to have to make some pretty major assumptions if you're going to try and come up with a reasonable answer to that. So let's talk about those. We've already said we need to know what our fuel's cloud point temperature is if we're going to know when to do what we need to do. So let's talk about that idea. Knowing what you need to know so that you can make the right decision at the right time. This whole when do we need to take action question, that really is all about, what does the temperature outside need to fall down to in order for me to know I have to put antigel in my stored fuel. Now, having said that, there are a few things we should point out about that question. First, the easiest way to answer this question, that question being, what's the temperature outside need to be in order for me to know I have to put antigel in? The easiest way to answer that question is if your fuel supplier has the cloud point information for your fuel. Let's say they give you a fuel spec and it says cloud point. If your fuel supplier has that, you don't need to do any more digging. You've got your answer. You know what the cloud point is for your fuel. However, for many people that don't have that information, their fuel supplier may not give it to them. Or another thing that happens to a lot of people is the fuel in that underground storage tank out there, or that above ground storage tank outside your office, the fuel in that tank is actually a combination of a whole bunch of different fuel drops that have happened over a period of time. And it may have been sitting there for a period of months, maybe even years. It's got fuel added from all different times. And so there's no realistic way of knowing exactly what the cloud point is of that fuel. So in the absence of having that kind of information, whether it's in your fuel specs or because of what we just said, you're going to have to make some educated assumptions. So let's see if we can help you do that here. So first, we start with the knowledge that diesel fuel that's used in the summer, what they call summer diesel fuel, that can have a markedly different cloud point than the diesel fuel used in the winter, or the winter diesel fuel. Winter diesel fuel tends to have kerosene blended into it. Typically, that's done either at the refinery or often they'll do it at the terminal. Um, Refineries, they will produce various types of diesel fuels, including summer diesel fuel and winter diesel fuel. And the reason they make different kinds is because they're trying to produce fuel that meets the seasonal requirements or the seasonal demands of the marketplace. Now, what makes winter diesel fuel different from summer diesel fuel is that winter diesel fuel contains a higher percentage of kerosene, or if it's been changed at the rack at the terminal, they may actually add some cold flow additives, possibly. And they do all of this in order to prevent gelling or waxing of the fuel in colder temperatures. The blending process typically is done at the refinery in order to ensure that the final product, the final diesel fuel product, meets the necessary cold weather specifications of where it's going to be used. Now, what does a refinery need to know in order to do this? Well, in order to help determine this, they want to know some idea of how cold it's going to get in an area. And one of the things that the refinery will look at is something we referenced before. It's something called the 10th percentile temperature of a given region. 10th percentile temperature for an area is the temperature at which either which or below only 10% of the historical temperature data for that region falls. In other words, if you took the historical averages for a given 30-day period, you rank them from highest to lowest, warmest to coldest. The bottom three figures would be the bottom 10%. And whatever that third, that number three is, that temperature would be, for that set of data, the 10th percentile temperature. So people who are trying to figure this out, they'll take the historical temperature data over a relatively long period of time. It won't just be like 1 month. Typically, they'll do it over a number of years or even several decades. They'll take the historical temperature observations for that region, and they will arrange the temperature values in ascending order from coldest to warmest. And the 10th percentile temperature, like we just said, is the value that corresponds to the point where only 10% of the data falls below it. In other words, it's a temperature you would not expect it to get colder than more than, say, 3 times in a given 30-day period. So if the refinery or the terminal knows this information, now they've got more information to help them blend things into the fuel to adjust the cloud point temperature of the fuel to play better in those temperatures. Now, once the refinery has created the fuel with the desired properties, the properties that it's confident will work in the market it's going to, the fuel is then distributed to the different fuel terminals or the racks, where it can be further mixed or further adjusted to meet specific regional or local requirements. And so that is how they do this. So earlier we said the best case scenario is if you have the cloud point temperature for your fuel from your fuel provider. But in the absence of that kind of specific data for your fuel, one of the things we can look to are the fuel specs from the two major pipelines, the Colonial Pipeline and the Magellan Pipeline. Colonial is the biggest fuel pipeline in the United States, and it runs from the Gulf Coast refineries all the way up to New York Harbor. And so you'll find a lot of places where, with respect to their fuel, they will refer to as their fuel is in keeping with or it meets the Colonial specs, and that's what they're talking about. And so for the Colonial Pipeline, the diesel fuel that's being distributed by the Colonial Pipeline, their summer cloud point specification is about 19 degrees Fahrenheit. And the winter cloud point specification is about 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the Magellan Pipeline runs from the Houston area refineries up through the upper Midwest. And their specs are for summer diesel, the cloud point should be 20 points Fahrenheit, and for winter it should be 14. And so that right there, by looking at those two things, we can get an idea of what our cloud points might happen to be. It would be a safe assumption that if you know you have summer diesel, your cloud point's probably going to be 19 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you have winter diesel, it's probably going to be 14, 15, 16 degrees Fahrenheit. However, keep in mind that those temperatures are the temperatures for the fuel coming out of the pipeline. The terminal then has the option of adding additional things like additional cold weather additives or even additional kerosene. And any additional kerosene blending or additional additive treating to lower the cloud point even further, that's going to happen typically after the pipeline receipt at the terminal before the fuel is sold. So for our purposes, since we can't know this for sure, we would say our recommendation would be if you've got fuel that you're trying to answer these questions for, we would say that for planning purposes, you'd be safe if you would assume that your summer diesel fuel has a cloud point of 20 and your winter diesel has a cloud point of 15. So now that you have some temperatures to shoot for, what do you do with that information? If you knowing what the cloud point temperature is, that can now tell us when we should put anti-gel in our fuel. Remember, we're not basing that kind of decision off of the cold filter plug point temperature because that's too equipment dependent. We're basing it off the cloud point because the cloud point is a fuel property and it's going to be the same no matter what you run it in. So we already established that in order for it to work, you need to have anti-gel treatment in the fuel before the fuel's cloud point hits. If you do that, if you have the anti-gel already in there and the fuel reaches the cloud point and those crystals start to come out, the anti-gel chemistry is now already in the fuel and it can start addressing those crystals, if you will. It can start working on those and start preventing the problem. If you put it in the fuel after the cloud point, after the wax has already started to come out, that's not really going to have that much effect on the crystals that have already come out in the fuel. You're a little bit too late there. So if you stick to thinking of this whole thing as needing to have anti-gel in your fuel X degrees above the fuel's cloud point, that's going to be your best bet for avoiding gelling problems. And that means you have to pay attention to the upcoming temperatures in your particular region. Best recommendation we would have, once you know your fuel's cloud point is, pay attention to the forecasted temperatures in your region for, let's say, the next 30 days at a time. And when you see those temperatures, those low temperatures, being forecast to drop to within 10 degrees above your cloud point, that's your signal to start the wheels rolling on treating that fuel. So if the cloud point of your fuel is 15 to 20 degrees, right? Depending on whether you have summer or winter or a mix of summer winter diesel, if it's 15 to 20 degrees cloud point, that means that you're looking for forecasted temperatures hitting 25 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, when exactly that can be expected to happen can be very different for different parts of the country or even different parts of the same state in some cases. I mean, in our home state of Florida, right, temperatures couldn't reach 30 degrees in December, January, but that's only up in the northern part of the state, like in the panhandle. If you're in the central part or the southern part, it rarely gets to 30 degrees. And so that means that at some point in December or January, North Florida might have to think about cold flow, but Central Florida and South Florida doesn't really have to. They just have to worry about other problems like microbes from all that water in the surrounding environment, right? So start traveling further north from Florida and look what happens when you get into the winter months. In the month of October, across the country, there are only a handful of states that see, historically speaking, they see temperatures dipping into that danger range of 15 to 30, 25 to 30 degrees, or -1 to -4 degrees centigrade. Some Colorado typically will happen, northern Nevada, but not southern Nevada. Northern Nevada, eastern Oregon, Montana, maybe. And then there are a handful of other additional states where it sometimes gets there, sometimes doesn't. Utah, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, upstate New York. Most other areas of the country for the month of October, such as the Southeast, they're still too warm in the month of October to really have to expect to worry about it. But moving to November, the situation starts to flip, if you will. Now, in November, the number of states whose low temperatures are dipping down into that danger range, the number of states where that's happening actually now outnumbers the number of states that don't. So if you take the minority and you say, what states would you still not have to expect this to worry about this problem in November? Well, Florida, South Texas, Louisiana, most of the Gulf Coast states, most of the Deep South states, that is Deep South below Tennessee and Virginia. Most of California, you don't have to worry about it. And then the mid-Atlantic region, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey. Those areas, you don't usually have to worry about gelling in November. The rest of the country, you typically will be seeing your low temperatures dipping comfortably down into that cloud point danger region. Moving to December, now it's pretty much everywhere. The only states historically that don't see low temperatures in December getting down to 25 to 30 degrees are most of Florida and Southern California. Virtually all the rest of the country is going to have to worry about gelling problems by the month of December. If you go around the country in December, you look at the historical lows. I mean, you've got Arkansas is -7. These are centigrade. -7 centigrade, Kansas -15, Ohio -16, Wisconsin -24, North Carolina -10. Pennsylvania can be -13 to -19, depending on what's part of the state you're in. So the broader lesson here is you need to pay attention to the forecast wherever you're at. These figures are the historical figures, and they're based on years of data on what temperatures can be expected. But as we were just saying at the beginning, we might be in for a colder than normal winter, which means the actual forecast where you're at might differ from these historical figures. So your safest bet is just monitor the monthly forecast wherever you are. Look at what's going to happen or projected to happen over the next 30 days. If it looks like that temperature is going to drop into that 25 to 30 degrees area, make plans to get your cold flow improver anti-gel if you haven't gotten it already, and then make plans to implement your treatment plan to get it into the fuel in advance of these cold temperatures. Okay. One question we often get when we're talking about this is, how often do you need to treat your fuel with an anti-gel? In other words, someone might say, well, I treated with anti-gel at the start of winter in October. Do I need to treat it again later on? Well, the answer is once you treated with anti-gel, you are typically covered for the season. See, anti-gel chemistries, because of how they work, they do get used up as the fuel gels in the same manner that fuel stabilizer chemistries get used up, neutralizing the chemical reactions that happen in the fuel over time. Now, exactly how much gelling would have to happen in your fuel in order to fully use up this anti-gel? That's a really difficult question to answer, and most people in most situations don't have enough information to actually be able to answer that kind of question for them. So you have to, you do make somewhat of a general answer, and that is for the vast majority of cases, as long as you treat your fuel one time at the start of the season, you're going to be covered for the rest of the season in terms of preventing cold weather gelling. So to recap what we were talking about, recapping all the aspects of answering the question of when you should plan to treat your fuel with Cold Flow Improver Anti-Gel. We started off by saying they're projecting a colder than usual winter for us, so this is a good time to talk about this. And anti-gel is something you need to have in your fuel before the fuel hits its cloud point temperature. Remember that. The temperature outside at which the previously dissolved wax content of the fuel starts to drop out makes the fuel cloudy. So in order to know more exactly when to treat your fuel, you need to know your fuel's cloud point temperature. Sometimes you'll have that information. Many times, though, you won't, especially if the fuel in your storage tank has been one of those mixes that has developed over a period of time. Now, the refineries, when they send the fuel out, right? Summer diesel tends to cloud at 19 to 20. Winter diesel clouds at around 15. And so that's what we use. Those are the assumed cloud points we use in the absence of specific information for us. So what you want to do is pay attention to the upcoming low temperatures in your area and make plans to set a treatment and anti-gel treatment plan in motion when you see the low temperature forecasted to drop to within, remember, 10 degrees of the cloud point, which means you're looking for lows between 25 and 30 degrees Fahrenheit. When that will happen depends on where in the country you are. Most of the country is going to be safe through at least October. So it's the months of November and December that are of concern. Bottom line here, though, is you need to pay attention and monitor the situation where you're at. And so that is going to do it for this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Thank you very much for joining us. Look in the show notes for links to the various things that we talked about today. If you haven't done already, please subscribe to the show at your favorite podcast purveyor of choice. Feel free to leave us a good review, as that is one of the big ways that helps people find us. So once again, I'm Eric Bjornstad, your host for the Fuel Pulse Show podcast and your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. I'll see you next time on the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.